The blizzard struck without warning, turning the mountain highway into a treacherous ribbon of ice and swirling snow. Marcus Thompson gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck, his weathered hands steady despite the violent winds. At 62, the former Army sergeant had weathered worse storms, both literal and metaphorical, during his 40 years. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts, urging travelers to seek immediate shelter. But Marcus couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to fulfilling the promise he'd made. In the passenger seat, wrapped in an old military blanket, lay Ranger, a German shepherd, whose amber eyes reflected a pain that went deeper than the arthritis in his joints. The dog had belonged to Marcus' war buddy, James Wheeler, who had passed away 3 weeks earlier. James' final words echoed in Marcus' mind as the snow pounded against the windshield. The veteran's last request had seemed simple enough at the time, but now, as they drove through this supernatural storm toward Wheeler's childhood home in the Colorado mountains, Marcus wondered if they would survive. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the wall of white ahead, creating a disorienting tunnel effect that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Marcus could feel the wheels struggling for traction on the increasingly slick road. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, his ears pricking forward with an alertness that seemed out of place. Given his advanced age and recent grief, the dog began to whine softly, a sound Marcus had learned to interpret during their 3 weeks. It wasn't fear or discomfort, but something else entirely, something that reminded Marcus of the detection dogs had worked with during his military service. Those animals had possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger, locate hidden threats, or detect the presence of people long before human senses could register anything unusual. Ranger's behavior now carried that same quality of urgent recognition. The dog's nose twitched as he pressed it against the passenger window, his breath fogging the glass. As he scanned the white void beyond, Marcus slowed the truck to a crawl, trusting the animal's instincts. Years of combat had taught him to pay attention to subtle warnings, whether they came from fellow soldiers or four-legged companions. Something was out there in the storm, something that had captured Ranger's complete attention. Through the swirling snow, a faint orange glow flickered in the distance, barely visible between the towering pine trees that lined the mountain road. Marcus squinted through the windshield, trying to determine if what he was seeing was real or merely a trick of the storm. Ranger's whining intensified, and the dog began to paw at the window with increasing urgency. The orange light grew brighter as they approached, revealing itself to be the warm glow of windows in a log cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, quickly dissipating in the fierce wind. Marcus pulled the truck into what appeared to be a driveway, though it was nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding snow-covered ground. The moment he turned off the engine, Ranger began barking, a deep, purposeful sound that cut through the howling wind. The dog's eyes were fixed on the cabin with an intensity that made Marcus' chest tighten with recognition. He had seen that same look in Ranger's eyes only once before, on the day James Wheeler died. The dog had stared at his master's hospital bed with exactly this expression, as if he could see something that human eyes couldn't perceive. Now, as they sat in the truck surrounded by the raging blizzard, Ranger's behavior suggested they had found more than just shelter from the storm. The cabin's front door opened before Marcus had even stepped out of the truck, and a figure emerged silhouetted against the warm light within. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun stood in the doorway, her hand shielding her eyes as she peered into the storm. She wore a thick wool sweater and appeared completely unfazed by the brutal weather conditions. Marcus gathered Ranger in his arms, noting how the dog had gone rigid with anticipation, his entire body trembling with something that seemed more like recognition than cold. As they approached the cabin, the woman's face became clearer in the glow of the porch light. Her features were weathered but kind, with deep-set blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of mountain wisdom. She stepped aside without a word, gesturing for them to enter the warmth of the cabin. But it was Ranger's reaction that stopped Marcus cold. The moment the dog caught sight of the woman, he began to whimper and struggle in Marcus' arms, his tail wagging with a fervor that seemed impossible for an animal so recently bereaved. The woman's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the German shepherd, and Marcus could see tears forming in her eyes.
Jimmy?
She whispered a single word that changed everything, Jimmy. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and impossible recognition. The interior of the cabin was exactly what Marcus had expected from the outside, rustic and comfortable, with handmade furniture and walls lined with photographs spanning decades. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. But what caught his attention immediately were the military photographs, prominently displayed on the mantelpiece. Images of young soldiers in dress uniforms from what appeared to be the Korean War era. The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor Wheeler, moved with the careful precision of someone who had lived alone for many years, but still maintained the habits of hospitality. She poured coffee from a pot that seemed to have been waiting for their arrival, and settled into a rocking chair across from Marcus. Ranger had positioned himself at her feet, his head resting on her shoes in a gesture of familiarity that defied explanation. Eleanor's voice was soft but clear as she began to speak, her words carrying the weight of long-held secrets and carefully guarded memories. She explained that she was James Wheeler's older sister, the one who had raised him after their parents died, when he was just 16. She had been waiting in this cabin for over 50 years, she said, waiting for her brother to come home and fulfill a promise he had made before shipping out to Korea in 1952. Eleanor reached into a wooden chest beside her chair and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the knot and spread the letters across the coffee table between them. The envelopes were yellowed with age, some bearing military postal markings, others with civilian addresses. Marcus could see that they were addressed to various recipients, but all were written in the same careful handwriting. Eleanor explained that these were letters James had written during his final leave before deployment, letters he had asked her to mail only if he never returned home. But James had returned from Korea, wounded and changed, and the letters had remained unmailed for decades. He had asked Eleanor to keep them safe, promising he would come back one day to retrieve them and deliver them personally to their intended recipients. That day had never come. James had built his life in distant cities, married, raised children, and fought his own private battles without ever returning to the mountain cabin where his sister waited. Now, as Eleanor spoke, Ranger's behavior became clear to Marcus. The dog wasn't just recognizing Eleanor as a stranger who smelled like his master. He was recognizing her as family, as someone whose scent had been part of James Wheeler's earliest and most cherished memories. The letters, Eleanor revealed, contained apologies, confessions, and final words intended for fellow soldiers' lost loves, and family members who had never known how deeply James had cared for them. Marcus lifted one of the letters from the table, noting the careful script and the weight of the paper. The address was local, belonging to someone named Catherine Morrison on Pine Ridge Road, just 10 miles down the mountain from where they now sat. Eleanor explained that Catherine had been James' high school sweetheart, the girl he had planned to marry before the war changed everything. She had married someone else while James was overseas, but he had never stopped loving her or regretting the words they had spoken in anger before his deployment. The letter in Marcus' hands contained James' apology and his blessing for the life she had chosen without him. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she revealed that Catherine still lived at the same address, now a widow herself, still wondering what had become of the boy she had loved so fiercely. Other letters were addressed to fellow soldiers' families, containing messages of comfort and memories that James had been too young and too hurt to share when he first returned home. One was addressed to his commanding officer, containing a confession about a mistake that had haunted James for decades, a mistake that had cost lives and had never been properly reported or acknowledged. The weight of these unmailed communications had followed James throughout his life, a burden that had shaped his relationships and his ability to form lasting connections with others. Ranger stood suddenly, his attention focused on something beyond the windows. The storm had begun to subside, and pale moonlight filtered through the thinning clouds, illuminating the snow-covered landscape outside. The dog moved to the front door and began to paw at it insistently, his behavior suggesting he had detected something significant in the night air. Eleanor and Marcus followed him to the door, opening it to reveal a scene of pristine beauty. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by deep snow and crystalline silence. In the distance, the lights of other cabins twinkled through the trees, each one representing a potential connection, a possible recipient of one of James' long-held messages. Ranger stepped onto the porch and lifted his nose to the wind, his posture alert and purposeful. He seemed to be processing scents and sounds that carried information about the surrounding area, information that might prove crucial to completing the mission they had unknowingly begun. Marcus realized that Ranger wasn't just grieving the loss of his master. He was carrying the weight of unfinished business, the same burden that had followed James Wheeler throughout his adult life. The dog's instincts were guiding them toward resolution, toward the completion of promises that had been postponed for far too long. Eleanor disappeared into the back bedroom and returned with a heavy coat and a pair of sturdy boots. She announced her intention to accompany Marcus and Ranger on what she called Jimmy's final mission. Despite her advanced age, she moved with the determination of someone who had been preparing for this moment for decades. She loaded a canvas bag with the letters, a thermos of hot coffee, and a flashlight, her movements efficient and purposeful. Marcus helped her into his truck, noting how Ranger had positioned himself between them, as if serving as a bridge between past and present. Between the brother Eleanor had lost to war and the friend Marcus had promised to help. The dog's presence seemed to give both humans a sense of direction and purpose that neither had possessed alone. As they drove down the mountain road, now passable but still treacherous in places, Eleanor began to share stories about James as a boy. She described his love of animals, his fierce loyalty to those he cared about, and his tendency to take on responsibilities that were too heavy for his young shoulders. These qualities had made him an excellent soldier, but had also left him vulnerable to the kind of psychological wounds that weren't recognized or treated in his era. The stories painted a picture of a man whose entire life had been shaped by his desire to protect others, even at the cost of his own happiness and peace of mind. The first stop on their journey was Catherine Morrison's house, a modest ranch-style home with a porch light that seemed to welcome visitors even in the early hours of the morning. Ranger's excitement was palpable as they approached the front door, his tail wagging with anticipation. When Catherine answered their knock, Marcus was struck by how much she resembled Eleanor, both women sharing the kind of timeless beauty that comes from lives well lived despite their share of sorrow. Catherine's hand flew to her throat as she recognized Eleanor, and her eyes widened with disbelief when she saw Ranger. She had known about Jameis' death, she explained, having seen his obituary in the local newspaper, but she had been unable to attend the funeral due to her own health issues. The letter Marcus placed in her hands seemed to weigh more than paper had any right to weigh. As she read Jameis' words, written more than 70 years earlier but feeling as fresh and immediate as if they had been penned yesterday, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. The letter contained not only his apology for their bitter parting, but also his gratitude for the love they had shared, and his hope that her life had been filled with joy and fulfillment. Catherine invited them inside, where she showed them photographs of her own family, including children and grandchildren who bore a striking resemblance to the young James Wheeler. She revealed that she had never forgotten him, that she had kept his letters from overseas, and had often wondered what words he might have spoken if they had been given the chance to reconcile. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at Catherine's door. A middle-aged man stood on the porch, his face creased with concern and exhaustion. He introduced himself as Dr. Michael Harrison, Catherine's neighbor and physician, who had been making house calls due to her recent health scare. But as the introductions continued, another connection emerged that none of them had anticipated. Dr. Harrison's father had served in the same unit as James Wheeler in Korea, and his name appeared on one of the unmailed letters in Eleanor's bag. The letter addressed to Sergeant William Harrison contained Jameis' account of a battle that had gone unreported, a moment of heroism that had saved lives but had never been officially recognized. Dr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears as he read his father's story through Jameis' eyes, learning details about his father's service that the older man had never shared with his family. The letter explained how Sergeant Harrison had risked his life to rescue wounded soldiers under enemy fire, an act of courage that had haunted James because he felt he had been too paralyzed by fear to provide adequate support. The guilt had followed James throughout his life, but his letter revealed the profound gratitude he felt for serving alongside such courageous men. Dr. Harrison explained that his father had died the previous year, still carrying his own burdens from the war, still believing that he hadn't done enough to bring all his men home safely. The pattern continued throughout the night as they delivered letter after letter, each one creating connections and healing wounds that had festered for decades. At the home of Martha Rodriguez, they found a woman whose father had served as Jameis' radio operator and had died in the battle that James had written about so eloquently. The letter to her family contained details about her father's final moments, his courage, and his love for his family back home. Martha had grown up wondering about the circumstances of her father's death, and Jameis' letter provided the closure she had never thought possible. At each stop, Ranger seemed to know instinctively which letters belonged to which recipients, his behavior guiding them through the night like a furry compass of the heart. The dog's presence also seemed to authenticate their mission in ways that words alone couldn't accomplish. People trusted the grief they saw in Ranger's eyes, recognized the loyalty that radiated from his every gesture, and understood that this was indeed a sacred trust being fulfilled. By dawn, they had delivered 7 of the 10 letters, each encounter creating ripples of healing and understanding that spread beyond the immediate recipients to their families and communities. The final 3 letters posed greater challenges, addressed to people who had moved away or whose current whereabouts were unknown. Eleanor suggested they return to her cabin to regroup and plan their next steps. The morning sun transformed the snow-covered landscape into a wonderland of sparkling crystal and dancing light. Ranger seemed more relaxed now, as if the completion of most of their mission had lifted a weight from his shoulders. Back at the cabin, Eleanor prepared a hearty breakfast while Marcus used her computer to search for the remaining letter recipients. The first was relatively easy to locate, a former soldier now living in a veterans facility in Denver. The second required more detective work, eventually traced to a retirement community in Arizona, where the recipient had moved to be closer to her grandchildren. But the third letter presented a mystery that initially seemed unsolvable. It was addressed to someone named Robert Chen, with no indication of his relationship to James or his current location. Eleanor examined the letter more closely, noting that it bore a different date from the others and had been sealed with red wax rather than the standard envelope closure. This letter, she realized, was different from the others in ways that suggested it carried special significance. The formal weight of the paper and the careful calligraphy of the address indicated that Robert Chen had been someone important in Jameis' military experience, perhaps an officer or a civilian whose role had been crucial to their unit's success. As they discussed strategies for locating Robert Chen, a car pulled into Eleanor's driveway. The visitor was a young woman in her 30s with Asian features, and a professional demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. She introduced herself as Lisa Chen, a social worker from the County Veterans Services Department. She had come to check on Eleanor, she explained, after receiving a report about unusual activity in the area during the blizzard. But as she mentioned her surname, Marcus and Eleanor exchanged meaningful glances. The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore, and when Marcus showed her the letter addressed to Robert Chen, Lisa's composure cracked. Robert Chen was her grandfather, she revealed, a Chinese-American translator who had worked with American forces during the Korean War. He had died 5 years earlier, but Lisa had grown up hearing his stories about the American soldiers he had served alongside. Her grandfather had spoken often of a young soldier named Jimmy who had saved his life during a particularly dangerous mission behind enemy lines. Robert Chen had credited James Wheeler with giving him the courage to immigrate to America after the war and build the life that had eventually led to Lisa's own career helping other veterans. The letter Lisa now held conveyed Jameis' gratitude for Robert Chen's service and his acknowledgement of the translator's crucial role in saving American lives. It also contained a confession that James had never reported Robert Chen's heroism through official channels, a failure that had troubled him for decades. The emotional weight of the moment was interrupted by Ranger's sudden alertness. The dog had been resting peacefully by the fireplace, but now he stood with his ears pricked forward and his body tense with attention. He moved to the front door and began pawing at it with the same urgency he had shown the night before. When Eleanor opened the door, they saw a figure approaching through the snow, an elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. As he drew closer, his face became visible in the morning light, revealing features that bore a strong resemblance to the young soldier in one of Eleanor's photographs. The man introduced himself as David Wheeler, Jameis' son, who had driven up from Colorado Springs after receiving a call from the Veterans Hospital about his father's final arrangements. He had never known about Eleanor's existence, he explained, having grown up believing that his father had no living relatives. James had kept his family history carefully compartmentalized, sharing few details about his childhood or his life before marriage. David's eyes filled with tears as he met his aunt for the first time and learned about the letters that had been waiting for delivery for so many decades. Ranger approached David cautiously, sniffing his clothing and studying his face with obvious recognition. The dog's acceptance of this stranger as family seemed to validate David's identity in ways that words could not accomplish. David revealed that he had brought something with him, an item that his father had asked him to return to the cabin in the mountains after his death. From his car, he retrieved a wooden box carved with military insignia and mountain landscapes. Inside the box were Jameis military medals, some photographs, and a journal that documented his thoughts and feelings throughout his adult life. The journal contained references to the unmailed letters, expressions of regret about his inability to return to the mountains, and detailed descriptions of his love for Eleanor and his gratitude for the childhood she had given him. It also contained sketches of the cabin drawn from memory and plans for renovations he had hoped to make when he finally came home. Most poignantly, the journal documented Jameis' relationship with Ranger, whom he had adopted as a puppy from a military family that could no longer care for him. James had seen in Ranger the same loyalty and courage that had characterized his best memories of military service, and he had trained the dog to serve as both companion and protector. The final entries in the journal revealed Jameis' growing awareness of his own mortality and his desperate desire to complete the unfinished business that had shaped his entire adult life. He had specifically requested that Ranger be entrusted to someone who would understand the dog's special qualities and his role in carrying forward Jameis' legacy of service and sacrifice. The reunion of James Wheeler's family, both human and canine, created a moment of healing that seemed to transform the mountain cabin into something sacred. Eleanor, David, Lisa, and Marcus spent the day sharing stories, examining photographs, and planning how to honor Jameis' memory in ways that would benefit other veterans struggling with similar burdens of unfinished business and unresolved trauma. Lisa's professional expertise proved invaluable as she explained how many veterans carried guilt and regret that could be addressed through family counseling, peer support groups, and community recognition programs. David revealed that he had inherited his father's desire to help other veterans, having worked for years with organizations that provided housing and job training for returning soldiers. The conversation naturally evolved into plans for establishing a foundation in James Wheeler's name, dedicated to helping veterans reconnect with estranged family members and complete important personal missions that had been interrupted by military service. Ranger seemed to understand the significance of these discussions, moving between the family members and resting his head on their laps in turn, as if offering his approval and support for their plans. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus realized that his original mission had evolved into something far more significant than simply delivering a dog to a new home. Ranger had led them to discover a network of connections and relationships that had been waiting decades for the right moment to resurface and flourish. The dog's instincts had guided them through a complex web of human emotions and relationships, helping to heal wounds that had seemed permanent and irreversible. Eleanor announced her intention to deed the mountain cabin to the James Wheeler Foundation, creating a retreat center where veterans and their families could come for healing, reconciliation, and renewal. David committed to using his inheritance to fund the foundation's initial operations, while Lisa offered to coordinate the professional services that would make the program effective and sustainable. Marcus found himself accepting a role as the foundation's director, recognizing that his own military experience and his bond with Ranger made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate similar journeys of discovery and healing. The dog, sensing that his mission was nearing completion, seemed more relaxed and playful than he had been since Jameis' death, as if he understood that his master's final wishes were being fulfilled in ways that exceeded even Jameis' most hopeful expectations. The final 2 letters were delivered with the ceremony and reverence they deserved. The recipient in Denver wept as he read Jameis' words of encouragement and brotherhood, sharing his own stories of survival and recovery that demonstrated the lasting impact of military bonds. The woman in Arizona expressed gratitude for learning details about her brother's service that she had never heard before, details that helped her understand his struggles with civilian life and his eventual path to healing and happiness. Each delivery was witnessed by Ranger, who seemed to serve as both guardian and validator of the sacred trust being fulfilled. By the time they returned to the mountain cabin, the dog had regained much of the vitality and joy that had characterized his relationship with James Wheeler. He played in the snow with David's children, who had arrived for an impromptu family reunion, and he supervised the unpacking of Jameis' belongings as they were integrated into Eleanor's home. The sight of Ranger teaching David's young son how to track animals in the snow created a bridge between generations that honored both the past and the future. Marcus realized that his role as Ranger's caregiver had evolved into something more like partnership, with the dog serving as both companion and guide in their shared mission of helping other veterans find peace and purpose. The James Wheeler Foundation's first official act was to create a registry of unmailed letters, unfinished business, and unresolved relationships that other veterans wanted to address. The response was overwhelming, with letters arriving daily from across the country. Veterans wrote about estranged children they wanted to reconnect with, fellow soldiers they had lost touch with, and civilian friends who deserved apologies or explanations that had been delayed for decades. Each case was approached with the same reverence and attention to detail that had characterized the delivery of Jameis letters. Ranger became the Foundation's unofficial mascot, his presence providing comfort and credibility to veterans who were struggling to articulate their deepest needs and fears. The dog's ability to sense emotional distress and provide nonverbal support proved invaluable in helping veterans open up about their experiences and their hopes for healing. Marcus discovered that his military training and his bond with Ranger created a unique qualification for this work, allowing him to serve as both counselor and advocate for men and women who had sacrificed much for their country and deserved better support in return. As winter gave way to spring, the mountain cabin was transformed into a vibrant center of activity and healing. Veterans arrived regularly for retreat weekends, family reconciliation sessions, and peer support groups. Eleanor's cooking and hospitality created an atmosphere of warmth and acceptance that helped visitors feel safe enough to confront difficult emotions and relationships. David's business expertise ensured that the Foundation operated efficiently and ethically, while Lisa's professional connections provided access to counseling services, legal aid, and medical support when needed. Marcus and Ranger developed a routine of daily walks through the mountain trails, visits to local veterans in need of companionship, and evening sessions around the cabin's fireplace where stories were shared and bonds were strengthened. The dog's presence seemed to give visitors permission to express vulnerability and emotion in ways that purely human interactions sometimes couldn't facilitate. Ranger's own journey from grief to purpose served as an inspiration to veterans who were struggling to find meaning and direction in their post-military lives. The Foundation's success attracted national attention, with media coverage highlighting the unique approach of using animal companions to facilitate veteran healing and reconciliation. Marcus found himself speaking at conferences and training sessions, sharing the story of James Wheeler's final wish and its unexpected consequences. He always emphasized Ranger's central role in the mission, describing the dog as both catalyst and guide in a process that had touched hundreds of lives and created lasting changes in families and communities across the country. The German Shepherd's reputation spread beyond the veteran community, inspiring other organizations to explore the therapeutic potential of animal-assisted interventions for trauma recovery and relationship building. But regardless of the recognition and acclaim, Marcus knew that the Foundation's true success was measured in quieter moments, in phone calls between estranged family members, in letters finally sent and received, and in the peace that came to veterans who had carried burdens of regret and unfinished business for far too long. On the first anniversary of James Wheeler's death, Marcus and Ranger returned to the cemetery where their friend was buried. The headstone now bore an inscription that honored Jameis' military service and his dedication to helping other veterans, a tribute that had been funded by the families who had received his unmailed letters. Ranger lay down beside the grave with the same reverence he had shown throughout their journey, his presence serving as a bridge between the living and the dead, between promises made and missions completed. Marcus reflected on how a simple deathbed wish had evolved into a nationwide movement for veteran healing and support. The dog at his side represented the power of loyalty, intuition, and unconditional love to transform grief into purpose and isolation into community. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Marcus made his own promise to his departed friend. He would continue the work they had begun together, honoring the bonds between veterans and their animal companions while helping other military families find the healing and reconciliation they deserved. Let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story from, and don't forget to share your own tales of the loyal companions who have touched your life. If these stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances resonate with you, please subscribe to ensure that these important narratives reach the veterans and families who need to hear them most. Our next story explores another remarkable bond between a veteran and their faithful companion, revealing how love and loyalty can overcome even the greatest challenges. Thank you for joining us in honoring the service and sacrifice of our veterans and the incredible animals who stand beside them through every battle, every victory, and every journey home.